All right, coming back to our discussion of the dura mater, we said that there was a periosteal layer that lines the bone and a meningeal layer that is closer into the brain and touches the other meninges, specifically the arachnoid mater. Embedded in between those two sublayers of the dura mater, we see these blue structures here. And like I mentioned in the other video, dural sinuses are basically veins, except that they can communicate with the CSF via arachnoid villi. And so that allows our brain to get rid of all kinds of waste and metabolic products that we don't need anymore. So all of these dural sinuses supply or bring waste out from various points of the brain. And even though this model is kind of weird looking, it looks like the guy has a mohawk, just imagine the brain is sitting in its place. And if we know the parts of the brain and we know our anatomical terminology, the names of these dural sinuses are not so hard. Now the dural sinuses, as they sit inside some little partition made of the dura mater. So these dural partitions, you might also hear them called dural septa. Same thing, it just means a little wall in between brain parts. Help to anchor the brain in place inside the skull and also provide these sinuses somewhere to go. So let's name the septa first. So the first and major one, the one that really looks like a mohawk here, is called the falx, F-A-L-X, cerebri. And that helps to separate the two cerebral hemispheres from each other. The falx cerebri, this guy here, dives deep inside of the longitudinal fissure between the cerebral hemispheres. So that's what lives in there. Now, separating our cerebrum up top from our cerebellum below, this dural partition is known as the tentorium cerebelli. So the cerebrum's up top, the cerebellum's below, and it forms a tent on top. So the tentorium cerebelli. Now we're going to remove this just so that we can see more clearly. And so from this view, we're able to see the different cranial fossa. So our anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and our posterior cranial fossa, which houses the occipital lobe of the brain here, and our cerebellum here. So just like our cerebrum, our cerebellum has two hemispheres, a left and right. In between, we have another little dural septa, and it's really tiny, called the falx cerebelli. So it's a little line that separates the two cerebellar hemispheres from each other. Now, if we're looking at the dural sinuses, so let's work our way from the falx cerebri back down to where we were before. So if we're looking here, and based on anatomical position, within the falx cerebri, there are two dural sinuses, a superior one that runs in the sagittal plane and an inferior one that runs in the sagittal plane. The superior one is known as the superior sagittal sinus, and the smaller inferior one is the inferior sagittal sinus. Pretty easy if you know your anatomical direction. Now the inferior sagittal sinus is a branch of another smaller sinus called the straight sinus. And if you're looking in anatomical position, it points straight anteriorly. The superior sagittal sinus, on the other hand, is a branch off of an area along the posterior cranial fossa called the confluence of the sinuses. Basically, this is where a bunch of sinuses, the straight, superior sagittal, and some others merge together. So this whole area is the confluence. So straight sinus coming in here, superior sagittal sinus coming in here, and then laterally on each side you have, running in the transverse plane, the transverse sinuses. Running inferiorly from the confluence of the sinus, inside of the falx cerebelli, is the occipital sinus. It's right on top of the occipital bone. And last but not least, forming a little branch off of the transverse sinuses on each side, forming kind of a little S-shaped move, is called the sigmoidal sinus. Sigmoidal means S-shaped. So sigmoidal sinus on each side.